I've decided that loving myself is the most selfless act of all.
C'est la nuit. Pluie. Les lumières du cinéma se roquettent par terre. La foule sort, se disperse. Reste
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Poetry to Your Ears. I'm your co-host Loulou, and I'm with Tom.
Hello.
And we have our special guest today, Maggie.
Hello, how are you?
Hi,
Yeah,
Maggie.
really good. I just need to ask how I say your last name.
Bowyer.
Bowyer, okay. So, yeah, Maggie Bowyer is an American poet joining us today. They're a poet, a cat parent, and the author of various poetry collections, including Ungodly and When I Bleed. They are an essayist with a focus on endometriosis, chronic pain, and trauma. They have been featured in many magazines. I won't get into the depth now, but you can read them all. They were the editor-in-chief of the Lariat newspaper, a quarter-finalist in Brave New Voices 2016, and they were Marilyn Miller Poet Laureate. You can find their work on Instagram and TikTok at maggie.writes. And we're talking to you today about your new book, Allergies.
Yeah.
Poems about love and grief. Congratulations for getting this book out.
Thank you guys so much for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, so it's out actually in a month, it's 7th of February 2022, so it's you can pre-order it now.
2023.
Yes, it's the new year. Sorry, I haven't switched off yet.
First time out loud, isn't it?
Yeah.
I'm writing it down.
Yeah, I think something that is quite unique about you, to me, compared to other poets, is that you self-publish all of your collections.
Yeah.
And
it's a big undertaking, but I think that you can do a lot more creatively with it. I think it's a lot more accessible, and I think that it allows you the opportunity to also retain more of your financial money from publishing as well. And so for poets in particular, I think it's a really, really great option. And so I love self-publishing and talking about self-publishing.
What do you think about a Substack model?
The Substack model is great, especially with the downfall of Twitter. And I think that I think we'll see it changing. And I don't think that any form of how you present your poetry is going to be bad. Like, I do Patreon. That however you can monetize your work, however you can fund your creativity and share your work with the greatest audience, however you're finding that work for you. Some people really do better digitally. Some people really like the idea of being in print. And so I think it's really whatever is really working for you.
Yeah, musicians talk about this change from their music being product to being a service, right? It's kind of like a cynical way of looking at art, but I mean, does that factor in? It's kind of strange to think of your poetry as a service, right?
It is, but I tell people the average first-time poetry book sells 26 copies. So if you want to be a full-time author or even a part-time author and make substantial or decent money from it, you do have to market yourself like a service or provide other services like us.
That's about what I've sold so far. Actually. Yeah, about that, I think. I printed 50 copies for my first print, and I think I've sold about half of that.
Yeah.
But yeah, I published it in November, so I'm not worried,
Honestly. There you go. Congratulations.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, so we're talking about you. You're this really established poet, and I just want to go back to kind of the roots, how you started poetry, how did you stumble upon poetry, maybe?
Yeah, I've always loved writing. I went to a Montessori school. I don't know if you guys have those in the UK, but it's very much where they allow and I didn't go to this school for very long. I went to traditional public school by middle school, but our middle grades. But I really always gravitated. They allowed you to kind of gravitate towards what you liked, and I always gravitated towards writing and English. And I was really into current events and fiction writing and things like that. But I went to a camp in New York for a few weeks with the magazine, and I fell head over heels for poetry. And I was 14, and I never looked back. I started doing spoken word when I was 15 or 16, and that is really what propelled me fully into the poetry community, I think. I stepped away for a little bit in college, but quickly found my way back to it, especially during the pandemic. I think allowed us all to kind of explore different parts of ourselves again. And so, yeah.
Yeah,
Really?
that's
So-
really young to start to go to spoken word events. I don't think I know any teenager going to spoken word stuff.
In New York,
Um,
the spoken word events.
I went to spoken word events locally in Greensboro, North Carolina at first, and then
Oh wow.
for Brave New Voices for my local team. And Brave New Voices is an international festival and competition. And I traveled to Atlanta for that one. I've been as far as Alabama for poetry, I think. And yeah, but I did do the camp was in New York. So I did get to go to New York for some poetry related things. It wasn't spoken word. I have.
And what's the
Mhm.
What's the Alabama poetry scene like?
It's really cool. It's very, I think that people think the South is very racist, and there's definitely a lot of racism in the South, but there's racism everywhere in America, but it has a lot of culture, like a lot of soul. A lot of Black people are from the South, and so it's a very diverse scene, and I think that you actually lack a lot of that in the Midwest. And up north, you actually lack more diversity than in the South, which is surprising to many people.
Yeah.
And so I think that the Alabama scene is one of the more diverse scenes I've been to, which again surprises people. And it's very soulful. It's very historical because there's a lot there about slavery and about Birmingham has a lot of history with that kind of thing. And so it's very informative, historical, soulful, cultural. So.
Are there any topics that poets touch on there that might be different from other places?
Yeah, definitely a lot of racial poetry, but there's also a lot of nature poetry. Alabama is surprisingly beautiful. From there, but it's actually like surprisingly. There's a lot of nature poetry from Alabama. Atlanta also has a lot of racially motivated poetry. It also has a lot of city urban poetry and about like urban cityscape versus that natural. Like Alabama's more like naturistic poetry. Around where I'm from in North Carolina, it's kind of a nice mix. We have a lot of nature. We have a lot of like urban cityscapes, so it's kind of a mix of both. And I think that here a lot more of the topics are social justice, a lot of LGBTQ plus, a lot of about education. We also have a lot of history about segregation and things like that. So here also talks a lot about different racial topics. So North Carolina is also surprisingly like very progressive in its poetry scene, at least.
Vibrant, yeah. Cool. Unless there's something you want to ask, Éloïse, I'd really like to hear some poetry.
Yeah.
Yeah, like did you prepare some poetry for the show? Or?
I did. I brought a couple of pieces. I brought 2 pieces from Allergies. So.
And it's I was going to say earlier, it's a really big collection as well, isn't it? Really large collection. So how many poems do you have in that collection?
About 140.
Yeah, wow. And how long did it take you to write that many poems?
Well, so I've written 4 collections over the last 2.5 years or so, but they
Mm.
have poems as far back as 2015. So over the last 7, 8 years. But most of the poems, I will say, are from the last 2 years or so.
Mm.
Yeah. So, and I'm always working on, side note before I read, I'm always working on like 4 projects at once because I'm very ADHD. And so usually it's poems over 2 years. But again, I'm working on like 4 projects at once. So they kind of overlap at times.
Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, which one do you want to read?
This one is called Places I Have Unexpectedly Found Joy.
Mm.
In clocks constantly moving me further from my trauma. In worm castings coating my hands. In scrubbing clean last year's pots. In wiping down my limbs. In my brain. In the barely lit corner of my church parking lot. Huddled over a pipe in my back seat. At the top of the stairs at the funeral home. In a musty room with an ornate casket. In my mom's waxy complexion, jagged hairdo she would have despised. And cleansing my hands. In knowing worm food is not capable of abuse.
Really nice. You have a lot of poem lists in your collection that kind of, I guess, scattered around the collection, just a little list of stuff.
Yeah, I've been very into list poems lately. I think that Seneca Bastallo and April Renee on Instagram both have been really big inspirations of mine over the last year or two. And they write a lot of really great prose poetry. And I just started like looking around at my life and being like, here's a list, like everywhere, like little things kind of collected in my mind of like, this all represents love to me, or this all represents growth, or this all represents like moving on or beginnings and different things like that.
Hello, Loulou here. I hope you're enjoying the conversation so far. I have an exciting announcement to make before you can continue listening. Poetry to Your Ears is now sponsored by Benki Publishing. Benki Publishing is an indie micro-publisher that champions neurodiverse artists and writers from other marginalized groups. So you can get a 10% discount on all books with the code Poetry to Your Ears 10. This code doesn't apply to zines, but it covers all books on their website, which is www.bentkeypublishing.co.uk. The code and the website link will be written in the episode description. We hope you find a poetry book you like, and tell us on social media if you purchase one. Now, back to our conversation. I see that a lot in zines, little like handmade zines that people do as like lists of stuff, but I find it kind of original and nice to see them in a poem, really.
Thank you.
Yeah, do you want to tell our listeners what Allergies is about?
Yeah, Allergies is all about like grief and love. I had a loss in 2020, as I'm sure many of us have experienced. I mean, every day, all the days. But had a particular loss at the beginning of 2020 that was actually my first love, and it hits you hard. You're like, ooh, you're in a happy relationship, and you're moving forward in your life, but you're like, oh man, that hits that nostalgic part of me, that really young part of me. And it kind of echoed into other losses of my life, other griefs that I had experienced. And I started thinking about like what grief meant and how it was impacting my relationship and my relationships with others, my friends, my family. And I really looked to what grief had taught me about love at that point. about how to love, how to put yourself out there, what kinds of love I really wanted, versus what kinds I wanted to leave behind with that grief. And so the book is really about like how to cope with loss, looking back at loss, what our relationships in our past can teach us about love, and how they can inform our relationships in the future.
And what is the allergy metaphor that in this process of grief and love?
Grew up with a lot of grief and loss, and I lost my mom when I was 16, but that wasn't the first of losses. And I always felt really different and really, I didn't understand why I was moving through the world differently than other people with that like pressure and that grief and that loss. And I always thought that like maybe I was allergic to different things, like different people. And I realized as I got older that, and especially through the pandemic, as we were all going through grief, I think that we're all kind of allergic to ongoing grief was the idea. And none of us react well. Like we all break out in emotional hives when it comes.
When you said we were all going through grief in the pandemic, you mean grief for what, our freedom, or grief for friends?
People. Yeah, grief for the relationship, grief for, I think in the disabled community, we go through a lot of grief still about like normalcy, and like a lot of us still don't have our normal life back. A lot of us have lost people through the pandemic. There's been a lot of death, and not just because of the pandemic, like because of the illness, but also just in the repercussions of the illness, and in addiction rise and suicide rise, homelessness and things like that. We've all, through one way or another, we've lost housing, we've lost jobs. Like all of us have lost something in the last 2.5, 3 years, I think. And so I think a lot of people are more intimately understanding grief than ever before. I think it's always been an isolated feeling incident, like a lonely thing and a thing that can't all connect. But now we're all going through this grief at the same time and have
this great collective trauma.
Yeah, it's very It is. And I think we're seeing how none of us react well to 3 years of like ongoing grief,
I think in a way, if you relate this collection to the pandemic, it's kind of a nice timing, because it's been now 3 years and some of the life is moving on, some of the life isn't really, or some of the life is lost from the past, and we can start processing that, right? It's like we're only just starting to process all of these events that happened, and I feel like for 2 years we're just in the middle of everything, and you can't even reflect and understand.
And how?
Yeah,
go ahead.
Yeah, it's just like it was just a surreal state of affairs, right? And every day some new measure came out, and it was just kind of like, okay, I guess, let's like carry on.
And it's like, how do we want to move forward from here in a more loving way? And how do we want this grief of the last 2 or 3 years to inform how we move on as a society? And how we really mitigate not just the pandemic and future pandemics, but also how we mitigate child hunger, how we mitigate, grief, and how we mitigate workplace as we all go through grief. Like, should we have more time? Should we have more maternity and paternity leave? And in America, especially with a lot of those things, as we don't have a lot of, as many of maternity, we don't have any maternity.
Yeah. It's not like the paradise of France.
Yes.
Well, I mean, there's been a lot of strikes in France and in the UK about public services, so it's always an ongoing subject.
And it's always
our rights.
Yeah, and there's still hardships everywhere, and there's move forward better. So it's like, how do we the more personal part of the collection is like, how do I move forward in relationships and let my past inform my better and love better, but also on that broader scale, how do we let this past inform us moving forward and to love each other better and create like a more loving world?
Yeah, I think, the first. Sorry, go ahead, Éloïse.
No, you go.
The first poem in the collection is called Allergies, and it speaks about what you talk about, which you feel like you were kind of almost from birth kind of inherently allergic to existence or the world, or and you use a great metaphor of the milk, right? Like rather than having natural milk, you're on powdered milk from the start.
Yeah.
And you kind of see that as symbolic towards your relationship to the world.
Yeah, precisely. And it's like I feel like I've always grown up with grief, and I think that was a very unique position I was put in with the pandemic. I don't think all of us are innately aware of grief from like inception and things like that. So kind of, I just felt like it was a time that I was able to be like, okay, a lot of people are grieving right now. What can I do? How can I throw my gauntlet in there and like explain what I've learned over, 24 years of grief?
Yeah, but you had to go right back to the beginning. I mean, literally before you were born.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I really like this kind of ongoing theme about your relationship with your mother and the different feelings you have towards her. There's a poem in the beginning where you're feeling a lot of love towards her and sadness that she just died. And then further on in the collection, there's kind of maybe like resentment about how you grew up and the abuse that you went through. And it's just a very complex relationship, and I find that you manage to tell that in a very nuanced way. Because they are complex relationships, that it's not just one overwhelming feeling.
Yeah.
And evolves through time. I really like it.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. That was something I was honestly really nervous to talk about. And I think that, honestly, Jeanette McCurdy's book, I'm Glad My Mom Died, coming out around the same time, was like very cosmic and stuff. But
Have you read that book?
It's fantastic. If you haven't read it.
Is it? No, I haven't read it.
So what's it about then? I mean, other than the obvious.
It's that same nuance about her child stardom. She was Sam Puckett in iCarly, which was a popular here, and it's just about her child stardom and her mom's pressure on her, and her eating disorder that developed from that, and those kind of things, and then the freedom she felt from her mom passing, and like the ability for her to go into recovery and things like that she hadn't felt before. And I think it's really important that we talk about that nuance, especially as we're all going through more grief and as more people are losing people to different things, and a variety of things. But yeah, that grief is really nuanced, and no one really understood that as I was going through it, which I can't blame them. It's like I was 16, my friends were 16, so but that there is a nuance with a lot of grief. There's the loss of hope that the relationship will change or get better, or that you'll have that like life-changing conversation with somebody. There's things, but there's also moving on and like looking back at things with that new lens of adulthood and being like, oh, that wasn't okay, or different things like that. And I think it's important to talk about that nuance, because we're allowed to have complex feelings about our grief, no matter like what we went through with that person, no matter how dramatic it was. We're allowed to have nuanced feelings. Just because someone is gone doesn't mean you're not allowed to have like some negative emotions about that person. And I think so often we want to like sugarcoat it all.
That's a great point. That's such a great point.
Yeah.
We when someone passes, it's like we make them into a legend, right? We make them into it's like people don't want to hear bad things about the deceased, the past, and it's true, they were human beings and they had faults and flaws and things that still haunt us almost as well sometimes, So I think it's powerful and useful to talk about those negative aspects of relationships with people that have passed as well.
You have to you have to process all of it. You can't just process the good. You're not gonna really heal if you just process part of it.
Yeah, something that strikes me as well is how it all takes place at home. I feel like it's a collection about home, and maybe
What's that? A Dozen Ways to Court a Poet?
Court, yeah. Because it
like
has one of my favorite...
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think so. It has one of my favorite lines ever of poetry. I'll tell it later.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
High praise.
Yeah.
Favorite lines ever of poetry.
And
wow, great.
I have to write it somewhere, on the wall or something.
Yeah. From this excessive blush, thank you.
It's okay. The light doesn't show that.
Okay, we can't wait now, Éloïse.
Yeah. So, do you want to read the poem, or do you want me to read the poem?
I would love to hear you read it, honestly.
Okay. A Dozen Ways to Court a Poet. Be sloppy, making a mess in the kitchen by kissing me in the middle of dinner prep. Food left to spoil on the counter in our rush to the bedroom. Make me laugh and memorize them all. The boisterous, the snicker, the snort, the horse. Be prepared to give all of your forgiveness away, because I am constantly losing my head, even as it's resting against your chest. Promise me you'll always help me find the things I'm missing. Make love to me gently. Fuck me hard, but still. Tell me you think I'm beautiful. I have spent all day wrapped up in the ugliest parts of myself. Smudges and grudges accumulate over 15 years, and I fear I will never be done scrubbing my subconscious. Make time for me to cry, all the time. I'm tired of begging people to love me, feeling like I have to earn the right to exist when I never asked for any of this. I'm tired of teaching people how to love me. All it takes is a soft touch of your hand, hushed tones and lighter footsteps. I don't need eggshells, but I do require peace. I'm tired of asking for things. Truth be told, I have no idea what I need. You love me more than I know how to accept. I just need constant reminders. So it's such a beautiful poem to me. So my favorite line is, I have spent all day wrapped up in the ugliest parts of myself. I just like that you're embracing the ugly parts of yourself. I feel like that's something, and the idea of a hug, and just kind of shielding, being wrapped up, like with clothes or layers. There's something really kind of comforting, and I feel like in the process of healing grief, you have to spend time in areas that are not really comfortable, and finding comfort in these areas that aren't comfortable, if that makes sense. Yeah. But I just feel like it's an idea that's really hard to express, and this line just explains it. I don't have to add anything. Everything.
That's what poetry's about. Wow.
Yeah.
It's about like expressing an emotion, right? Like, and you doing it in a novel way as well, and just really giving voice to a feeling that doesn't have language attached to it. And obviously, Éloïse there has attached. She's really recognized. She's recognized that feeling in that language that you've so elegantly put together. And
yeah, I mean, I added kind of my own experience to what you're trying to say, and I think that's this dialogue of poetry that is constantly happening.
I was gonna say that's exactly what I want poetry to do. Like, I want to feel seen, but then I want you to feel seen. That makes sense. And I feel most seen in my work when somebody else sees themselves. If that. And so I think one of those beautiful things is to put really specific things in there that then somehow relates to somebody else's specific memories. You know what I mean? That idea that like you completely understand that like desire to be wrapped up in a warm blanket because you've been wrapped up in the ugly parts of yourself. And the idea of like, you know, watching cartoons on a Saturday morning representing love to somebody else. Like I've had people relate to that little kind of line before, and just those like little moments that then other people can find themselves in. I think that's the beauty of poetry, and that's the validation of poetry.
Be really specific. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, I love specific poetry.
Yeah, just like the details of your routine that you're putting in there. You know, there's a couple times like the grind of the coffee on Saturday morning. I really like that because I can smell it. I really like sensory poetry when you can smell it, you can feel it, you can touch it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I understand. I'm trying to like, that's one thing I'm pushing myself with is like to be less like big picture and more zooming in on those little moments, because I think those are those sensory moments when you can describe the senses that really puts somebody in that spot.
It's interesting, it kind of raises a question to me about kind of being really open in your poetry, you know, confessional, as opposed to almost like hiding secrets in your poetry or being cryptic in your poetry, right? So I think some people, some poets we've even had on the podcast kind of write poetry that's almost like a little bit more secret. There's almost like hidden meanings there, and there's secrets they don't explicitly even want to discuss in like an interview, right? How do you feel about that, like having secrets in your poetry?
I think there's like always room for every kind of poetry, so I don't want to be like wrong, because I'm like, oh, that's exactly what they're going for. And I think sometimes I incorporate that occasionally, you know, like that double language and that double meaning, and like, can somebody derive what I really mean? Or there's one poem in here that it totally sounds like a sexual poem, and it totally sounds like I'm going into this guy's bedroom and like taking off my clothes. He's gay. He's my gay friend. And so there is like kind of a secret meaning in there, and it is what that from it. For me, it was this moment, but for somebody else, it might be that sexual moment. And so I think there's definitely a place for that. I think that even within that, you can get really specific. I think.
Are you comfortable in your writing of kind of letting people not have all the answers? Are you comfortable with people, you know, not getting the poem?
Yes and no. Like, I think that so much of me like I think I'm growing more okay with that. I think I used to be like, oh, I've got to tell the backstory for this poem. They have to understand it. They have to that and the other. Now I'm at that place where I was saying like, oh, you seeing yourself in the poem makes me feel see what I saw, as long as you see yourself. And I think that's like kind of some growth I've had in the past year or so.
I mean, even if your poetry is really specific, I'd definitely feel some poems I'm like, okay, I don't know what they're talking about. Like, I don't know I don't know the situation. I can just make it up and see what it makes me feel. But I will never have the images that you have when you're writing about that memory.
Exactly. Yeah. And so that's that beauty of like, somebody else seeing their own. And I think that's something that's really changed for me recently, is allowing other people to just kind of take what they want from a piece.
Sorry, I've just been so moved by this conversation. I don't know how to just change this subject.
It's a heavy book sometimes. So.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about the structure of the book, because we've spoke on the podcast to Heather, who's laid out her poetry collection in seasons as well. So your collection here is laid out in seasons, and you start with winter and end on autumn.
Yes.
So what's the significance of seasons for your collection?
So I was thinking,
why did you choose to arrange it like that?
Yeah, I was thinking about the idea of allergies, and how we all like have different allergies at different seasons and go through those things. And then I was thinking about like the seasons of grief and how I lost my mom on Christmas Eve. So it was like the dead of winter, or like the beginning of winter, really. It was like right after the winter solstice. And so I was thinking about like, you know, the days getting longer and things like that, and it being winter, and how grief really to me was winter because of that, and was that cold time. And then how, you know, love was new growth and spring and these things, but then like lust was summer, and the mistakes I made in grief was hot and sweaty and confusing and colorful and vibrant, and like that was the memories of mistakes for me. And kind of once all of those mistakes, you kind of get through that really messy period of grief and you make all those mistakes, it for me really felt like everything kind of settled into place, like those fall leaves. And
there is something about autumn that is acceptance, isn't there? Like autumn is a kind of a time when you're kind of like, okay, everything.
Yeah, we keep talking about autumn in the podcast, and how it's, well, I learned in school that autumn was the season of poets. It is the predefined season for poets, because it talks about kind of death of nature. But I just like to see how, you know, every poet or different poets see the seasons, like what it means to them.
Yeah, and I can see how autumn would be death, and I think that honestly going into that, which I hadn't even planned this, but going into that, like, you can be accepting of death, you know, like that final chapter, like even if autumn were to represent death to somebody, like even as the final chapter, like you're going to go through another loss, you know, you're going to have another winter, you're going to have another loss, but all of the seasons you've been through in the past bring you to that spot and like have helped you accept more. And so when you get to that next autumn, that next death, that next loss, like you really are prepared, and you're able to kind of clean up the pieces. You're able to rake the leaves of the loss and, you know, kind of prepare for the really long winter of that loss. And you're able to do that a lot better than you were that first winter.
And you found comfort in your home, you know. Yeah. That's how I feel like this is about. I feel like it's finding
my next collection
comfort,
more focused on home. So it's so interesting. You know, I was talking about how I'm always like working on multiple collections, and I think that this time period in my life is just very much like making my home. And so it's really interesting that you got that, like that reflected in my poetry, because I really feel like the past few years of my life and the next couple years of my life are really about like homemaking.
I'm jumping ahead then. Yeah, it's like the seeds in this collection for the next one. Yeah, what are the 3 other subjects then for the projects?
Yeah, I have a project on home. I have a project on depression and self-love. I have a project on heartbreak and and another one on falling in love. Coming.
And how do you keep finding inspiration without feeling the pressure to write about specific subjects?
I think that's part of why I write so many collections, is so that I don't feel like I have to keep grinding on a topic that I'm not inspired on that minute. Like, okay, I'm not feeling writing about home right now. I want to write about love. Let me go. And sometimes they overlap, like home relates to love. There are love poems in the book about home, obviously. But and different styles, like different books will kind of have like this book had a lot more list poems, as you were noting. So different books will have different styles. So maybe I write a love poem, but its style isn't a different. And I think that's how I kind of avoid that stagnation, is kind of just working on multiple projects. And then finding inspiration, I think, is all about like, 1, paying attention in your everyday life to different little moments and the emotions that they bring up, but then also reading a lot of poetry.
Noticing.
Yeah,
I think I think it really inspired me to write some list poems.
Yes.
Because I'm always noticing stuff. Yeah, because I'm always noticing stuff, and I think, okay, just this, like the way the sunshine reflects on the building, that's not a poem. I wouldn't describe all of that, but making a list about all the things that I see when I'm walking, that, you know, for example, it would all become a poem. And yeah, it's just a different,
it's just a way,
creativity. Yeah.
Serious noticing.
Yeah. So how do we go about observing our everyday life and like all that in the beauty in it, and whether that's in nature, like whatever is your everyday life, go look for it. So you were saying like a lot of my time is spent at home, so a lot of my inspiration are the things that show me love from home, or show me the beauty of nature from my window, or those kind of things.
Yeah, I mean that's the tools in, you know, meditation and mindfulness, about noticing the small things. It's just not always obvious how to translate them into poems or into writing. Like many times I notice something and then I just kind of leave it there, and then I think, okay, that could be a poem, and then I feel the pressure to write. And then I think, no, it's just to be enjoyed in this specific moment as well.
Not everything has to be productive, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's this kind of intersection between, like, the pressure of productivity and the pressure of creation.
Well, that's the crisis with like photography and iPhones, right? Smartphones, where it's like you're out and you're enjoying a beautiful view, and then it's like you feel the need to capture it, right? You feel the need to capture that moment.
Yeah.
It's like
creation in that vein too. Is like, if you're creating content, are you like experiencing, I'm supposed to be a content creator, but then I often forget, because I do get wrapped up in the nature of it all, or the beauty of it all, or the family of it all, or whatever I'm doing. And but for poetry, I think it's one, looking back on those observations you've had, and things like that, but also to not feel the pressure. What I do is I often just like write down one sentence, and I have it in my ideas, and then I sit down and I spend like 20 minutes a day, 30 minutes a day, like writing. And so I go through and I say, okay, prompt, is it a couple of lines? Is it like, what is it where am I gonna start? And so sometimes it is a line I wrote down on my walk, but that I didn't want to flesh out a whole poem while I'm trying to enjoy my walk. And then the other thing is I keep my writing and my work very separate, which sounds crazy because my writing is my work, but I keep my work folder with all my Instagram captions and my different due dates on things and ideas of essays I need to write for work all in one folder. And then I keep my poetry in a whole nother section of my phone. I'm like far away, so that it doesn't feel like work. Like, that is my art. Putting it into a book, putting it onto the internet, that's my work. But creating is for me, and creating is for the art itself.
You keep it pure in your mind.
I really like this distinction, because it's not obvious how to know to market yourself as an artist without losing that artistry.
And I did for a minute, I think. I talked about on my story the other day, like, enjoy the micro poems while they last. I think I got really caught up in micro poetry from the internet. And I'm not saying micro poetry doesn't have like really strong things, and I'm not going to like completely abandon micro poetry. I'm still writing micro poetry.
Rupi Kaur.
But I'm
shout out Rupi Kaur.
Yeah, I'm kind of like moving away from it, because I really feel like I got caught up in that like marketing aspect of it for those in particular. And I'm like, oh man, I could market just one line from a poem. It doesn't have to be a poem.
Yeah, I really like what you started doing about, you have longer poems and then you take just a little bit and that's a post.
Yeah.
And then you can explore this.
I thought you were saying the opposite of that, though, Maggie. You're saying that you got too caught up in it?
I got too caught up in writing micro poetry for a while, and then now I'm starting to drift back towards like writing longer form pieces almost exclusively, and then I'm going to start sharing. If I feel like sharing a micro piece, I'll just take a line from it. I can still do that and market that way without letting the idea of marketing and micro poetry being marketable invade all of my art.
Yeah,
not
lovely.
to shame on all micro poetry. Again, like I write micro poetry and I read micro poetry. Like, it's not all bad. I just got really too caught up in it personally for a moment.
Yeah, you just want to explore different forms of writing and not worry about how they're going to be marketable. I think that's the idea behind it, right? And I think that's a lot of what art is just creating for the kind of, and not worry about the rules, just to say something or to just for the sake of creating as well, and just for yourself. And I think that's something that I'm trying to learn as well, is just doing it for myself and not worry about, are people going to understand this? Are people going to like it?
It's hard.
It's really hard, yeah.
The way I see it is I try and, like, when I'm writing, imagine that no one will ever read that poem. Like, okay, this doesn't have to be one I publish, this could go in my...
Yeah. Self-deception.
Yeah.
It works so well, yeah.
Exactly.
We do that we do that for our chores as well, right? We're like, if I just do a little bit of this chore, and just a little bit, and then you get suckered into it, and then you end up doing the whole chore, and it's like you trick yourself. So
yeah.
But it works.
It works. It really does. I'm honest because of that. I'm not worried. Oh gosh, is the subject of this poem gonna read it and it's gonna be like, oh gosh, you wrote a poem. Like, I'm not thinking about that. Am I thinking about oh, what are the insights gonna be on this? But no, I'm just thinking about the poem, and that made me write the poem.
Do you want to read us another poem that you picked?
I would love to. This is another list poem.
Yeah.
So, a non-exhaustive list of things I would miss without you. Talking on the phone every night during your meal break. Someone to always refill my water. Someone I'm not afraid to ask for anything. The shape of your smile, a curly bracket. How your lips are constantly, gently upon me. The way the cats run to the door when they hear your car pull into the driveway. Someone who laughs and my dad cracks in putrid puns. Someone who lets me in on the joke instead of making one out of me. Learning all of the scientific names for each plant as we pass them in the arboretum. Sticky note lists on the fridge under the keyboard, buried in the vase above the desk and stuck to every notebook. Falling asleep on the futon on Fridays with the sound of clacking keys and gamers speak fading out behind me. Saturday mornings at the markets, on the rare occasion we are both up and moving by 9. Driving you to the store on Sunday because I can't stand being apart an extra hour, and I'd rather spend my morning grabbing more coffee while you gather our groceries. The sound of your breathing deepening. Slowly slipping into snores, the comfort of knowing you're there without having to peek through my eyelashes, the sound of coffee being ground for me in the morning.
Beautiful. You're a master at intimacy.
Thank you.
Describing intimacy, I should say.
Thank you.
I'm sure you're a master at intimacy as well. But This it's really beautiful. This really leads me on to my favorite of your poems, which is Good Morning. And I think this is kind of a challenging poem for you.
That was the one I wrote in 2015. So I was 17 when I wrote that poem.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. I think you have to read it now.
Yeah.
I'll grab it.
I cannot keep the
Please.
tension.
I wrote that poem and I was super nervous to put it in this collection, but I actually had not seen this poem since 2015. And I wrote it about the person I lost in 2020. So I had written this poem in 2020, another poem about this person. And I was like, you know what, this poem sounds or feels really familiar. And so as I'm putting this collection together, I was like, oh, this poem reminds me of that lost poem. And I was devastated. And I took 2 weeks looking for this poem, searching everywhere I could. And they mirrored each other almost perfectly. Like they had 2 lines that just like, basically in this poem, I talk about like what he was afraid of losing his life to. And then in the next poem, like am able to kind of confirm he lost his life that way. And it was just like these beautiful poignant mirror images that I'd written like 7 years apart. And that I hadn't read this other poem in so long. And so this poem, I was like, you know what, I'm almost embarrassed to put it in here, but like, because it's 7 years old, 8 years old, but I'm gonna do it because it matches. And now I'm really glad I did, because you liked
it. Yeah.
It's quite impressive how sometimes like the lines in poetry can make sense of your life, and they just stay in your brain and they just pop out when they need to.
So the guy in this poem passed away in 2020. Yeah. Oh.
So this book is half for him. So yeah.
Yeah.
This is called Good Morning, but it's morning as in MORNIG. It was not cold muffins, crumbs left on my breakfast bar. It was not cold bed sheets after he left me sleeping. It was nothing. We were nothing. It was not cold muffins because he didn't stay for breakfast, and neither did my appetite. It was not cold sheets because we spent less than 10 minutes buried in them. It is cold hands clutched around phone screens because the ability to reveal everything has become easier digitally. I thought it was just sex to me. This was supposed to be parents aren't home and fun with camera phones. I was under the impression that he agreed with me, but I am colder than I once was. Quickly, the occasional quickie turned into 2-hour layovers where I laid over his chest, invested in the ways he had broken bones and cracked his heart. We sat for hours, passing each other the smallest bits of ourselves. In between elbow banging, he told me he was scared of liver failure and all the ways he failed his mother. I gave him all the parts my father had abandoned, tied together with all my insecurities, the shape of my pinky toes, and the way I talk too loudly. We gave each other everything. We were still nothing. He doesn't like baked goods. The bed sheets are no longer cold. I thought that he knew that this was just sex, but now I'm getting 7 texts and 3 phone calls waking me up. My groggy voice answering, hello? He was upset. My ears still stuffed with cotton balls and dreams heard only silence. It is 12:06 on June 3rd, and the clock won't stop reminding him she overdosed 3 years ago today. He blames himself. She was his first love, first to make love, to break love. I am realizing that sleeping in beds makes them warmer. We began sleeping closer. He warned me that he was the plot twist in her downward spiral. I tried to tell him people hit rock bottom even when they're not pushed. It was never just sex. As we laid in bed, our shaking hands reached for frigid sheets to cover vacant bodies. He'd forgotten how to love, and I had forgotten it was never me he was reaching for. I forgot to care. I wish it was still just sex, the same way I wish I had burnt those muffins and wish we'd never even made it to the bed. Maybe then we wouldn't remember how cold these sheets used to be. It was nothing. I wish we weren't still nothing. It is the morning after, snuggling into icy beds with no one next to me and waking up too tired to bake muffins. He is still mourning. I am still waiting.
That's really powerful. And it's incredible you wrote that when you were 17.
Thanks.
I think it really has a great, maturity to it. And just the feelings you evoke with your descriptions of intimacy, kind of freezing sheets and your really clever wordplay.
Thanks.
Quickies.
That's my
Quickly, quickies.
okay. That was honestly worth putting it in the book. Was just I was like the little quickie that turned. So. My friend actually gave me that title too. Gave me my birthday present was he always started poems with the title, and I always ended writing poems with the title. And he was like, writing from the title first. And so he gave me that title for my birthday. He was like, here's a title. Try.
That's such a nice birthday gift.
Right.
Yeah.
So.
Wow. Gifting a title.
I know. Poets, right?
Like a royalty.
I know, yeah. I have a friend who made a song that's called Good Morning as well.
See?
I like that. I like
that writing.
I like the simplicity of the line to make love and break love as well.
Thank you. Yeah.
This. I mean, there's so much in there. You know, there's so many great lines in there.
And
I really think
it really represents me now looking back, like how complex sometimes teenagers like lives are. Like we think like, oh, they're just kids, and like I want them to just be kids. Like I'm looking back and I'm like, oh gosh, like I'm a normal little kid there, but no. And
yeah, like all of these emotions, they're really complex and like complex to process for adults, and you don't always have the same tools when you're younger.
And I thought,
because it's
looking back now, I'm like, oh gosh, like I wish I had like, the whole cliche, like wait till you're older to have sex. But it's like, looking back, I'm like, gosh, like emotions do come with sex often. Like even if like, even if you're an adult who likes casual sex, like you mitigate your emotions around it, right? Like you have sorts on sex. And so I think that like I was so naive back then. And so like looking back now, I think that's one cool thing about poetry is you can it's like a scrapbook of your life. You can kind of see how your opinions on things have changed. And I think I was starting to realize it even then, like, we thought this was just sex and like it really was emotions.
Yeah. So now that we've gone through the poem and kind of we've heard the words from it, can you talk a little bit about what you meant by, it's almost like, since he passed away, the poem's kind of appreciated in different meaning, right? It's taken on different meanings. It's got different significance to it now, perhaps. There anything to you that jumps out immediately about that has taken on greater meaning?
Yeah, I think that it's really that idea of like, being lonely has taken on a new meaning for me, and like the idea of what we seek when we're lonely. I think I was a really lonely kid, and I was seeking out love wherever I could, and that included sex. And now as an adult, I'm differentiating between like what is love, what is lust, what is bad friendship and bad relationships versus loving friendships and loving relationships, and what is healthy family dynamics versus chosen family that is healthier, including your biological family in many cases. And that whole poem kind of took on that significance. And then there's another poem about his passing that I say, I pretend not to know your brother's middle name or all the ways you assumed you disappointed your mother. And I had written that, 7 years later or whatever, without having read this other poem. And I'm like, man, like we sit here and we think like all of these things, like he thought, oh, he disappointed his mother, but I've talked to his mother and he never did, And so it's like those little moments of like, oh, they didn't talk about that, and the way that brings on new significance to me now, and writing about it, being able to be like, you didn't disappoint your mother, and kind of like those childhood fears that kind of like linger into adulthood, and like how we can kind of squash those and like communicate more.
Yeah.
Such a healing book.
Yeah, it's that idea of like what kind of world do we build from here, including our most personal relationships. What kind of world do we want to build? One that has communication, and one that focuses on love and on, talking about our emotions, talking about, the past and healing from it, and not letting things like our fears kind of get in the way between that communication and those leaps of faith and those leaps of love and those leaps of protecting other people and taking care of them. Yeah.
And the last poem in the piece, it's called Good Days Free. And it ends on a kind of optimistic, hopeful note, like you're striking.
Yeah, I
right.
really wanted to. There's 3 bad day poems, and or bad night poems, and 3 good day poems, and kind of like that between day and night. And each poem kind of mirrors itself in structure. So if you like look at, they all kind of have the same exact structure, and just a few lines are changed within those poems, all 6 of them. And it really, I think, showed the transition between like those good moments and those bad, and then like the beginnings of those good moments. Those first good moments aren't that great, they're really like tenuous and like fragile good, and that good that's dependent on other people or holding you up and keeping you afloat in those first few good days and things like that. And then by the end, you can kind of hold yourself up, and those good days are dependent on the things you do. And so I kind of wanted to show that change between like needing support and then being the support for yourself.
Yeah. So do you look back on all the body of work of that time, and does it kind of represent to you some kind of journey that you've been on?
Yeah, definitely. I didn't grow up like in the greatest environment. If you have read the book, you'll understand a little bit more. And I blamed myself a lot of that time, and I shied away from support. And I think that it showed the need to, and that's the whole idea of like relying on community, and like what kind of communities do we want to grow. I want to grow communities that support people when they're going through hardships and hard times. Because I had that kind of community, you know what I mean? I didn't always, but at some point in my life and in the book, that changes. I find supportive community, and that really allows me that opportunity to heal. And so over the last few years, I really found supportive community towards college and post-college and things like that, as many of us do find ourselves and our footing at that and that moving into adult life and away from our sheltered life or things like that. And so, it really was that journey of like coming into adulthood, realizing my life wasn't normal, realizing like, oh, I can lean on people, find the support, and then eventually like be strong enough to allow other people to lean on me.
Shall we conclude on these beautiful lines?
On this positive note. Yeah.
Well, I hope that you enjoyed listening to our podcast episode with Maggie Bowyer. You can follow them on Instagram and TikTok at maggie.write and pre-order their book on their website. And you can follow us on Instagram as well, and TikTok and Twitter at Poetry To Your Ears. Thank you for listening, and have a good day.
And thank you for being on the show, Maggie.
Yeah, thank you for being on the show.
Wonderful to talk to you about your poetry. Thank you for sharing with us.
Thank you everyone for listening, and thank you for having me. It's been wonderful.
Une femme et un parapluie au coin de la rue, papotage féminin de voix. La brune rit, secoue ses cheveux. De l'autre côté de la rue, l'homme les observe, de loin, de dos.
Thank you for listening to Poetry To Your Ears. This podcast is published as a newsletter on Substack. All of our content is published for free, but if you would like to support our work, you can become a paid subscriber. This will help us afford transcripts for the deaf and hard of hearing community, and anyone who would benefit from reading the podcast alongside hearing it. You can also support us for free by rating the show on Spotify and Apple Podcast, or writing a review on Apple Podcast. Share the show with your friends, fellow poets, and poetry lovers. If you want to interact with us, you can follow us on @PoetryToYourEars on Instagram and @Poetry2 on Twitter, or you can also write a comment on Substack. If you're American and you're listening to us, send us a message. Half of our listeners are American. We'd love to hear from you. Until next time!